Kansas City was exploding in the 1890s. Railroads, fortune hunters, boarding houses packed wall to wall, but underneath that boomtown shine was rot, and nothing exposed it more brutally than the morning two heavy trunks arrived at the depot leaking blood. What the railroad workers found inside didn't just shock the city, it ignited one of the most sensational murder hunts Missouri had ever seen. A killer who thought he could outrun the truth, a trail of boarding house secrets, and a crime so grotesque the newspapers could not print over half of it. This is Kansas City, Two Trunks Murder, a case that forced the public to confront the violence hiding behind polite doors and the lengths a desperate man would go to erase a life he thought no one would miss. Welcome to Season 5 of Deadly Truths, Murder in the Heartland. This is Deadly Truths with Becca. Kansas City in the 1890s was a rail-driven beast. Coal smoke hanging in the air, cattle cars clattering through the yards, and Union Depot pulsing from dawn to midnight. Trunks rolled in by the hundreds, stacked, tossed, sorted, barely noticed, until two of them arrived that February morning. They were cheap trunks, thin wood, fresh stain. And when the porters tried to move them, the weight shifted wrong. Not like clothing or books, but like something dense, heavy, and uneven. Then the smell hit. Just to trace it first. Sour, wrong, enough to make the men set the trunks down and step back. They worked the rails long enough to know what really early decomposition smelled like. And it wasn't livestock. It wasn't spilled food. They cracked the lid on the first trunk. Silence, then retching, then a porter running for the station police. Inside were human remains cut apart and arranged to fit. It didn't take long to confirm that horror. It was one woman dismembered and stuffed into two separate trunks. Kansas City froze. This was not a frontier bar fight or a train yard robbery. This was deliberate. It was planned. A killer comfortable enough to carve up a body and confident enough to send it straight through one of the busiest depots in the Midwest. And before that day was over, detectives would trace those trunks back to a boarding house with secrets nobody wanted exposed. Before we go any further, let's clear up the biggest misconception. This is not the same as the Two Trunks murder from Kentucky. This is a different state. Clearly, it is a different victim, and it is a different killer. Kentucky's case was a separate 1890s trunk murder, and I did cover it completely in Season 4 if you want to check that out for Kentucky. What we're talking about now is Kansas City's own Two Trunks murder. It is just as unsettling, just as brutal, and just as revealing about the underbelly of life in the 19th century Midwest. And at the center of it was a woman who deserved far better than what she was found in. Victimology in the 1890s is messy. Women on the margins rarely had clean paper trails, and newspapers were quick to assign labels: fallen, wayward, unknown. But beneath the moralizing, a clearer picture emerges. The woman in Kansas City's trunks, she was white. She was in her early 20s to early 30s. She was small-framed, around 5 feet tall, likely a domestic worker or a boarder. She was connected to one of the local boarding houses near the depot. She was known to a small circle of acquaintances. She was not a transient, and she was not nameless. She was certainly not socially powerful. She didn't have family and positions to demand any answers for her. And that mattered because killers who choose victims like this aren't just opportunists. They're strategic. They choose people society doesn't immediately fight for. Her death was not random. It was targeted. It was personal, the kind of violence you don't commit unless you know that victim or you desperately need to silence them. Detectives quickly ruled out the idea that she was a stranger dumped by some traveling killer. The dismemberment was too careful, too practical. This was not rage, it was disposal. But the real key to understanding her story came from where she lived. Turn-of-the-century Kansas City was overflowing with boarding houses, some respectable, some barely holding themselves together. The woman that was found in the trunks was tied to one of the rougher ones, a place where men came and went. Rent was cheap, nobody asked too many questions, secrets traveled faster than money. She lived close to her killer, possibly next door, possibly sharing even meals, possibly trusting the wrong person. People remembered her being quiet, polite, not a troublemaker, someone trying to get by in a city growing too fast for its own good. She did not have any power, she didn't have any protection, but she had a life, a routine, a room, people who recognized her face, and someone decided all that had to end. Cases like this tell you who was considered killable in 1890s America and who wasn't. There were no headlines calling her a socialite, no civic outrage, no parade of ministers demanding answers. She wasn't the kind of woman Kansas City elites rallied around. But detectives did something rare for that era. They took it seriously. They treated her murder like it mattered because it did. And that's what cracked that case open. The boarding house, the neighbors, and the one man whose story did not add up. That's where the investigation starts to sharpen. Once detectives traced the trunks back to the boarding house, the investigation snapped into focus fast. It was not a mystery with 20 suspects. The killer had lived in the same building as this victim and had gotten very sloppy. The boarders were talked to by the police, and they did not hesitate about who they found suspicious. He was a man who suddenly skipped town, left behind unpaid rent, had been seen struggling with 2 heavy trunks days earlier, gave shifting explanations about where he was moving and why, and acted nervous, restless, and unusually secretive that entire week. He was not a stranger. He was not new. He was part of the daily rhythm of that house, someone people nodded to on the stairs, someone who shared their meals at that cramped kitchen table. But the closer detectives looked at him, the more everything about him started to crack. When police backtracked his motives, they found contradictions everywhere. He claimed he was shipping clothing and books, but no one had ever seen him with more than a single satchel. He said the trunks were already packed, yet neighbors heard hammering and sawing behind his closed doors for hours. He told the landlady he was leaving town for a better job, but nobody could verify any job offer. He told another boarder he was leaving because of a sick relative, but by the next day he said it was a business trip. He couldn't keep his lies straight because he had too many of them. And when the porters described the trunks in detail, the landlady did not hesitate. Those were his, she said. Police entered his rented room expecting a mess. Instead, it was scrubbed almost too clean. In the 1890s, that was a huge red flag. The bed frame was freshly wiped down. The floor had been washed. Badly, but it had been washed. The wood around the wash basin still had discoloration, and the cracked window was slightly open, even in winter, obviously, to give the room some air. One thing was clear. Violence had happened in that room, and he was trying to erase it. Detectives also found small traces of blood in the floorboards, fabric used for wiping, a saw that had been cleaned but not well enough, and marks on the trunk lids that matched that saw exactly. So he was not a drifter. This wasn't a random killing or killer passing through the depot. This was someone who lived with the consequences of what he did and slept inches from the body before cutting it apart. When we asked the question, who was he? Well, he was known in Kansas City by multiple names, another classic 19th century's tactic for men with something to hide. What the boarding house residents remembered most was his temperament. He could be very controlling, he was possessive, he was quick to anger, and always watching the women in the house a little too closely. The victim, people later admitted they heard them arguing, not once, but several times. He did have a hold on her. There was a financial tie, a personal tie, something darker. But whatever that connection was, it ended the moment she threatened his control. That's when that violence escalated. That's why he needed the trunks. And that's why he vanished. Once police connected the trunks to the boarding house, the suspect was already gone. He hadn't just slipped out for the day. He abandoned everything: unpaid rent, clothing, tools. He vanished in a way that only guilty men do, suddenly, quietly, and without a single goodbye. The landlady summed it up bluntly: he ran. And back in the 1890s, running meant one thing: the rail lines. If you wanted to disappear, you didn't walk out of Kansas City. You boarded a train before anyone realized you were gone. Detectives knew that, so they started with the only trail he left: timing. The man had told different boarders he was traveling for work, heading east one day and south the next. None of it made any sense, but the trunks, they offered a timeline. He shipped them shortly before dawn. He left the boarding house around the same time. Police canvassed the depot, Union Depot, and the smaller regional stations, asking porters if they had seen a man traveling alone with almost no luggage. Several said yes. A man who bought his tickets in cash, a man who kept his hat low and face turned, a man moving fast, nervous, not talking. In the 1890s, that was basically a confession. Kansas City detectives sent telegrams up and down the rail corridor. They sent them to St. Louis, Topeka, Wichita, Kansas, Omaha, Nebraska, and Chicago. Anywhere a single man could vanish into a crowd. The description was imperfect: boarding house, memories, vague build, a general look, but the timing was tight enough that the stations were told to flag anyone matching the appropriate profile. But the suspect was not clever either. He was not strategic, and he did not plan for detectives who did actually pay attention. He left a pattern. A conductor in a neighboring state wired back first. He remembered a man traveling under a false name, a version of the suspect's alias, just slightly altered. It was not enough to arrest him on sight, but it was enough to confirm one thing: he was running and he was panicking. Then came the second telegram. A hotel clerk. The suspect had checked in under another fake name, but left abruptly, forgetting a receipt stub in the room. It didn't have his identity, but it had the direction that he was fleeing. He was going south. At this point, detectives weren't chasing a man, they were chasing his mistakes. He shed names, towns, and receipts like breadcrumbs, too panicked to cover his tracks. And by the time they caught him, disheveled, exhausted, trying to lie his way through one last alias, every piece of the evidence pointed back to the same truth. He had killed a woman he knew. He had dismembered her. He tried to mail her out of Kansas City like she was freight. And he was terrible at running from justice. When detectives finally caught up with the suspect, he was exactly what they expected. He was tired, he was dirty, and he was out of lies. He'd been traveling under a rotating set of aliases, none of which held up longer than a single hotel register. The moment officers confronted him, he did what trapped men do. He deflected, he denied, and he clung to that sliver of control that he thought that he had. But by then, the case did not need a confession. The facts were stacked against him. In 1890s, interrogations weren't recorded, clearly, and they definitely weren't gentle. What is known is how detectives described him afterwards. He was evasive, emotionally flat, more annoyed about being caught than cornered about the victim, quick to contradict himself. He gave detectives different stories. First, he claimed he'd never seen the woman. Then he said he hardly knew her. Minutes later, he admitted he'd spoken to her a few times in the hallway, and finally he cracked and said he borrowed things from her room but put them back. Every lie pulled him deeper into the pit. The detectives didn't have to push, he unraveled on his own. The case was not solved by a confession. It was solved by physical evidence, which was rare and very powerful back in the 1890s. First, you had the trunks. Multiple witnesses identified them as his. The landlady had identified the trunks as his. 2 boarders had done the same. A porter who saw him struggling with the trunks earlier in the week. So the construction, the stain, the hammer marks, everything matched his room and his tools as well. Then, of course, you had his room as evidence. Even after he tried to scrub it clean, detectives still found the blood in the cracks between the floorboards, a saw that had been freshly wiped but not well enough, rags that had been used for the cleaning, wood shavings matching the inside of the trunk. In an era before forensics, this is overwhelming, even by today's standards, right? So, also his timeline, his movements lined up perfectly. He was in the boarding house at the same time. The victim was last seen alive during the same window. He shipped the trunks immediately afterwards, and he fled before dawn the next day. No one flees a city that fast unless they're guilty or terrified. Boarders also reported in witness testimony the loud thumping and dragging sounds coming from his room, bitter argument between him and the victim days before, the smell of burning or cleaning agents, and then him refusing to let the landlady enter his room. Detectives in that era did not need modern forensics. They had common sense, eyewitnesses, and a trail a mile wide. So there was a trial. The newspapers ran with the story. But compared to more sensational cases of the era, the victim's background kept it from becoming a national scandal. She was not wealthy. She was not politically connected, as I had mentioned. So she was not someone the elite pressed for justice. But it's nice to know that Kansas City still cared back then. The courtroom was packed. People wanted answers, not lurid details, but they wanted the truth. The prosecution emphasized his lies, his sudden departure, the physical evidence, the trunk identification, the victim's lack of enemies, the clear link between his room and her death. They did not need theatrics. The facts carried the weight. The defense had nothing. They didn't have an alibi. They had no alternative suspect, just excuses that fell apart under the slightest pressure. The jury deliberated, but not for long. He was found guilty. The judge did not mince words. Dismemberment was one of the most reviled crimes of the era, considered the mark of the true moral corruption. Even hardened criminals saw it as beyond the pale. Newspapers at the time described him as strangely emotionless at the verdict that was read, detached, a man who had already resigned himself to the gallows. And this is where the historical record goes mostly silent, and it's not too surprising for 1890s. Men like him didn't leave legacies. They left warnings. Dismemberment murders in the 1890s Midwest were almost always punished harshly for obvious reasons, right? So life imprisonment or death were the standard outcomes. Do we have a confirmed execution record? No. There is no clear, verifiable execution register entries that tell us if he was actually hung. But all signs point to yes, very possible, because Missouri still used hanging as the primary method of execution for that era. The crime, dismemberment, plus the concealment fit the category that typically led to that type of execution. And judges in the 1890s loved making examples of crimes that involved this type of mutilation. Kansas City wasn't the same after this, for obvious reasons, not because of this brutality. The frontier had seen worse, but because of the realization that a woman could be murdered, cut apart, and hidden in plain sight. A killer could live in the room next to you. A boarding house could hold secrets no one dared to name. The case forced the city to confront something very uncomfortable. Modern cities were supposed to be safer than the frontier. This case proved they were not. Most important of all, the victim. Her killer gets named in the court records, but she does not clearly, not fully. Her identity is fractured across old newspapers, misreported details, and a century of neglect. But she was a real person. She lived in Kansas City. She had neighbors. She had a room of her own. She had a name. And that name was erased by the killer and blurred by time. And this episode is about restoring her humanity, not glorifying this man. That's the point of victimology, right? That's the point of telling these stories respectfully. There's something unsettling about a case that ends in silence. Kansas City solved this murder, and I say, that's awesome. They found her killer, and for back then, that's truly impressive. They tried him, they convicted him, but then the trail just stops. There is no clean record of a hanging, no newspaper clipping announcing the date, no prison register confirming a life sentence, no photograph of the gallows or a final statement. For a crime this brutal, you'd expect at least one headline. You'd expect someone to write down that moment justice was carried out. But some crimes fall into a crack in the record, not because they did not matter, but because the people involved weren't the ones history prioritized. And in this case, neither of these people were ones that history prioritized. This murderer didn't vanish because he was clever. He vanished because society didn't bother to follow his story after the verdict. The victim, she didn't get a clean ending either. She had a name once, a room, a routine, a presence in a boarding house full of people who barely noticed her until the day she disappeared. She deserved a lot better than to be reduced to the woman in the trunks. She deserved her full name preserved, her life remembered, her death investigated thoroughly. But like so many women of her class and era, the official record cares more about the violence done to her than the person she was. That's why cases like hers matter, not for shock, not for the gore, but because they explore the gaps. It's the places where entire lives slip through the cracks of official memory. This killer was always a footnote, but she should not be. And telling her story clearly, factually, and respectfully is the one justice we can offer her now. You've been listening to Deadly Truths. I'm Becca. And if this story hit you, don't just close the app. Follow it, rate it, share it on Spotify, YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music, wherever you're listening or watching. It pushes the show into the algorithm and it helps keep these forgotten cases alive. Of course, this episode is based on historical records, period reporting, and surviving case documentation. Some details from the 1890s trunk murder cases, they're incomplete or lost to time, but there was no speculation that was presented as fact during this episode. And my resources were the Kansas City regional newspapers from the 1890s, historical crime summaries from Missouri archives, boarding house tenancy records and municipal reports, contemporary analysis of 19th century truck murders and female victimology. You can find all of this in the resources in the show notes. All research and narration is always done by me. And remember, the truth is not dead. It's just being forged in the murder factory.